economists say exchange rate is not that important, but they're all wrong. Exchange rate is the most important. Well, so then we go into a technical issue here, and that is, what kind of free trade do we have? So there are two parts to it, the tariff parts and the exchange rate part. The biggest problem is the exchange rate. They should have kept the dollar lower so that these people in the Midwest won't have to lose their jobs. So that's, in my view, the biggest problem. But we cannot talk about this yet because Trump thinks the protectionism is what is needed, not exchange rate adjustment. At least he's not saying we're going to do exchange rate adjustments, not yet. He's saying we need to do tariffs. And there we have to understand the free trade system we had until the Liberation Day was actually quite unfair. You have to understand the history of this thing. When the United States put together the GATT system, General Agreement of Trade and Tariff, GATT, 1948. At that time, Europe is burned down because of the war. Japan is completely in shambles because of the US bombing. But United States wanted these economies to recover quickly because of the Cold War and the Russian threat, or Soviet threat. So when the GATT system was put together, Americans allowed any country joining the GATT can decide its own tariff rate, as long as that tariff rate applies to everyone equally. That was the free trade, the GATT system. And Americans allow that to re-industrialize Japan and Western Europe quickly. So all these countries set a very high tariff rate so that the countries will recover. At that time, it was okay too for the Americans because the United States was the only manufacturing country that was still manufacturing. Europe and Japan were all destroyed. So US was actually running trade surplus. So the other countries are all deficits, right? Because they have nothing to sell, all burnt down. So that was okay 80 years ago. But with that system, Japan, Western Europe, everybody grew very rapidly. And starting in the mid-1970s, already US began to run deficits. At that point, US should have told the other guys, Japan and Europeans, that, hey, you already recovered. So this big difference in tariff rates should be corrected. Because at the moment, if a same car moves from Europe to the United States, the tariff is like 2%. But if the same car goes back to Europe, the tariff rate is 10%. This is terribly unfair. If you continue that, something will blow up at some point. But people were so comfortable in that environment, making a lot of money out of the Americans. That's the 41 trillion. So they didn't do it. Well, they did it. They adjusted, but only slowly. So when Trump said, let's have a reciprocal tariff, most Americans said, of course, that's right, because we've been treated unfairly, which means all these countries, Japan, Taiwan, China, Western Europe, they all have to either reduce tariff rates to match the American rates or allow Americans to raise the tariff rates to match theirs. This is only fair. And I think trade negotiators from Taiwan, Japan, Europe, they all understand this, of course. They're not stupid. They're the ones who put this in, right? So I'm sure they understand that they really were treating Americans unfairly. So they cannot tell that to the people at home. I don't think Taiwan trade negotiators are saying, yeah, we actually were very unfair to the Americans. They don't say that, right? Japanese trade negotiators may not tell this to the Japanese public, or the German trade negotiators might not tell this to the Germans. But they know inside that it has been unfair. So that's the level of trade negotiations. I think countries will adjust. This has to happen and will happen. So Taiwan might have to reduce some tariffs so that more American things can come in. Maybe more American cars will be on the road, who knows. But that unfairness is not the main reason for US trade deficit. The much bigger problem is the exchange rate. And the fact that US allowed this outrageously strong dollar to last for so long, doing nothing, will have to be addressed at some point, sooner the better. Because if you don't address the exchange rate, and if you just raise tariffs, the whole point of raising tariff is to revive the US industrial base. But if the companies realize that, well, the tariff rate is going this way, but the exchange rate is going that way, then they don't want to invest in the US, right? Both of them has to go in the same direction. But the market is a very unpredictable place. Exchange rate and tariff rates can go in opposite directions. In that case, there will be no increase in US manufacturing capabilities because companies are saying, at that exchange rate, I don't want to invest in the US. So eventually, the talk will have to go to the exchange rate. The tariff alone cannot solve these problems. Economists say exchange rate is not that important, but they're all wrong. Exchange rate is the most important. This is like 70-80% of the problem. The 20-30% may be tariffs. I think people in the foreign exchange market are beginning to realize this too, which explains what happened to Taiwan dollar last weekend. I think Taiwan dollar was, I don't know the word attacked is the right one, but when Taiwanese trade negotiators are in Washington negotiating, that means Taiwanese central bank cannot intervene to keep the NT dollar from rising. Because if during the negotiations, there's a report from your magazine or wherever, Bloomberg, that says Central Bank of Taiwan is intervening in the foreign exchange market to keep the Taiwan dollar lower, the Trump administration can tell the Taiwan trade negotiators in Washington, you are manipulating exchange rates. We're going to raise tariffs by double. This risk was very strong. This means during the negotiation, someone realized that the central bank cannot do anything. And that may be the reason why the Taiwan dollar moved so rapidly. This also indicates that even though some economists say exchange rate is not important, the people in the real world understand that exchange rate is very important. Given where Trump wants to go, he wants to reduce US trade deficit. This is his final goal. Exchange rate is important, which means the dollar cannot appreciate. And Asian, European currencies may actually appreciate. So that's why part of that we saw last week, the movement of Taiwan dollars. In terms of adjustment period, of course, no one wants to hold US Treasuries because you know that you can buy the same thing cheaper 6 weeks from now. So if you know that the dollar will be weaker 6 weeks from now, you better sell it now and buy it when it's cheaper 6 weeks later. But if everybody sells it, price of the Treasury will fall, US interest rates will go up. This is, I think, the key reason why Trump has been very quiet on exchange rates until now. He knows that if he openly says we want dollar to weaken, everyone, Americans, Taiwanese, Japanese, everybody will be selling US Treasuries. US interest rates go much higher. And Trump is a real estate person. Real estate person is always very sensitive to interest rates. And that's why I think he has been quiet on exchange rates. But the market can outguess Trump. Everybody began to realize that Trump wants the dollar to be actually weaker, then they will act sooner instead of later. Because if you act sooner, you make more money in this case. And I think is beginning to happen in the foreign exchange market. This is something that has to happen. The dollar has to fall if Trump's goal of reducing trade deficit is to be achieved. I don't think raising tariffs will reduce U.S. trade deficit by a large amount. In order to make sure that it falls, adjustment in exchange rate is essential. The question is how orderly this adjustment is going to be. In 1985, G5 countries faced the same issue, huge protectionist pressure in the United States because the dollar was too strong, and it was handled very carefully to bring the dollar down. And at the beginning, for 2 years, it worked. US interest rates did not increase all that much. The dollar was cut in half. So at the beginning, it was 240 Japanese yen. 2 years later, it was 120 Japanese yen. So it worked. But that was done very carefully, very secretly, behind the scenes. All these people had to coordinate the activities to make sure that market does not, blow up. A lot of people, however, have forgotten Plaza Accord. So I don't know how the lessons from Plaza will be utilized this time around. But eventually, we have to do something like it together, not just the US, but the rest of the world too, to adjust this so that the people who were victims of US trade deficit will be reduced in number. We will never get this down to zero. It's too difficult. But we can reduce it to a point where these people will not destroy the free trade. That should be the goal. Then free trade can stay. And it's the free trade that helped Japan grow, Taiwan grow, China grow. Everybody became richer because of free trade. And so even though some adjustments in tariff rates are necessary for political reasons, that should not be the main show. The main show is how do you adjust the exchange rate so that US trade deficit will actually come down to a more politically sustainable level.